and welcome to Jay Coletti's Racket Reviews. My name is Jay Coletti, and I will be your hostess. Here on Racket Reviews, we are dedicated to learning about all things organized crime. I hope all of my American viewers enjoyed their long Labor Day weekend. And today, I'm really looking forward to spotlighting the founding gangster in Tampa, Florida, and that's Charlie Wall. While the Trafficantes do rightfully get credit as being the most powerful mobsters in Tampa's history, none of that would have been possible without Charlie Wall and the groundwork he laid and the groundwork that got stolen from him by the Trafficante family. If you're enjoying the Racket Reviews channel and would like to become a patron, please head on over to the Patreon account and join the Coletti family. Now, without further ado, we have much to discuss, so let's get right to it. Charles, or Charlie McKay Wall, was born on March 10, 1880 in Tampa, Florida. He was the son of Dr. John Perry Wall and Matilda McKay Wall. Charlie Wall's connection to Tampa and the type of financial and political privilege he was seemingly born into is uncommon in our discussions about organized crime, particularly with a founding member, so let's dig into that family history a little bit. And let's start all the way back with Grandpa Wall. Perry Green Wall, his grandfather, was born on November 2, 1809 in Liberty County, Georgia. He would then move to Jasper in Hamilton County, Florida. In 1830, he married Nancy Ann Hunter Wall, with whom he would have 6 children, the fourth of which was John Perry Wall in 1836. Perry Green Wall would go on to have 3 wives in the course of his life. He would also have another daughter with his second wife, but for our purposes today, let's stay focused on Charlie Wall's lineage. Perry Wall had a military career, serving in the battalion of the Mounted Rangers in 1832 and 1833 before they were disbanded. He served as the county clerk in Jasper before moving to Hernando County in 1845, where he was elected probate judge and served until the start of the Civil War in 1861. He would move to Tampa in the winter of 1870-1871, where he would again be elected probate judge and serve as postmaster for 1 term. A firm Baptist believer and seemingly fair judge, Perry Wall was loved by his communities. He would die peacefully in 1897 from an illness that had lasted several weeks, according to reports. Dr. John Perry Wall, Perry Wall's 4th child, born on September 17, 1836, would continue in this prominent family's good standing. He too had a military career with the Confederates. He was a captain, commanding officer of the 4th Florida Infantry. He also had a medical career and would serve as assistant surgeon in the 9th Regiment of the Florida Infantry. Dr. Wall had been volunteering as a surgeon at the Chimborazo Hospital in Richmond, Virginia. This hospital had served Florida troops in the Virginia area. He left for a short time in 1859 to visit Brooksville, Florida. This was in order to marry his 19-year-old sweetheart and daughter of a wealthy planter, Cressy Eubanks. Dr. Wall was 23 at the time. The couple would move back to Richmond for a short time, then return to Brooksville, where Dr. Wall had his practice for several years. They would then move to Tampa in 1869. In that time, Dr. and Mrs. Wall would have 4 children, 2 of which died in infancy, 1 which died at 3 years old, and a son, John Perry Wall Jr., who would survive into adulthood and go on to be a lawyer and a scholar. Dr. Wall would open a practice in Tampa, then the couple would have their 5th child in 1870. Dr. Wall would travel to Cedar Key to treat a cabin boy with yellow fever in 1871. Dr. Wall himself contracted the deadly disease and survived, but he brought it home to his wife and youngest daughter, both of whom died from it. Devastated and no doubt racked with guilt, Dr. Wall would spend the rest of his professional career pursuing answers about yellow fever. In his personal life, he would turn to alcohol as a balm for his pain. Already prone to drunkenness, the loss of Dr. Wall's wife and daughter, which came as a result of his work, sent him over the edge. He was known as, quote, a hard drinker and a hellraiser. He must have maintained some charms, though. A year after his wife's passing, Dr. Wall was able to court the extremely lovely and eligible bachelorette Matilda McKay, daughter of the former Tampa mayor, Captain James McKay. When Dr. Wall asked Captain McKay for his daughter's hand in marriage, McKay refused. He was well aware of Dr. Wall's drinking problem. In exchange for Matilda's hand, Dr. Wall swore never to drink again, and Captain McKay agreed to the matrimony. And apparently it worked. According to most sources, Dr. Wall never drank again. At the very least, it's known that Dr. Wall never drank again while he was married to Matilda. Matilda and Dr. Wall would try for children unsuccessfully for 8 years, either due to miscarriage or infant birth, before finally having one son, Charles McKay Wall, in 1880. With the lovely Matilda, who could be described as nothing if not a perfect lady, and the now sober, brilliant Dr. Wall, Charlie Wall had every opportunity in the world. During this time, Dr. Wall had helped form the Florida Medical Association, had become one of the Surgeon General's top consultants on yellow fever research, and owned a private practice in Tampa as well as serving as mayor of Tampa from 1878 to 1880. All of this fascinating history sounds pretty par for the course for old money or rich families in a big city. So what on earth changed that made Charlie Wall the gambling kingpin of Tampa? Let's find out. Matilda McKay Wall died in 1893 after having been ill. Charlie Wall was only 13 years old. Both Dr. and Charlie Wall were devastated by this loss and were sent spiraling into a depression. It is suspected that Dr. Wall went back to the bottle, but it cannot be confirmed. He did throw himself into his work. 6 months after Matilda's death, Dr. Wall married the family's housekeeper, Louisa Williams. Charlie Wall's stepmother was physically abusive and often had him alone since Dr. Wall was usually away on business. On April 18, 1895, at an annual Florida Medical Association meeting, Dr. Wall was invited to again be the guest speaker. He would not return home. At this meeting, it is reported that Dr. Wall, while reading his paper on public hygiene in the light of recent observations and experiments before the Florida Medical Association, simply fell back and died after having not been feeling well throughout the day. The exact cause of his death was never established. Now 15 years old, Charlie Wall was left in the brutal hands of his stepmother. He hated her. By June of 1895, we begin to see Charlie Wall transform into a violent criminal. At this point in time, he would shoot and injure Georgia Glover, the family cook. He shot her in the head with a revolver just above the left eye. He was arrested, then soon released. It is widely believed that Wall shot and killed his stepmother, but somehow this story cannot be corroborated. It is highly likely that he did shoot and wound her, which was what got him sent to military school. This school was no match for Charlie Wall. While considered intellectually bright and a successful student, Wall would be expelled from the academy because he was visiting a brothel. After he returned to his stepmother, if she was still living, Wall would avoid her by going to brothels, gambling, drinking, and developing a morphine addiction. And it was at these establishments that he would soon find work. Living in Tampa, the main gambling operation of the day was Bolita, or the Cuban lottery. By 1907, the young Wall had mobilized and had become a casino owner. He was arrested that year for running an illegal casino. This did nothing to stop him from going on to run several. Because of his political and societal connections, Charlie Wall wasn't offering the thrills of gambling, drinking, and prostitution to just average laborers, like so many of his competitors. No. Wall was able to appeal to Tampa society's rich and famous, the city's best and brightest. While hobnobbing with Tampa's elites, Wall found himself involved in election fraud and bribery. These activities would serve him well. He was now in the business of paying off law enforcement, stuffing ballot boxes, and buying votes. It's reported that, quote, many observers staunchly believed that during these decades, when Wall ruled the city's political structure, there was not a single honest election in Tampa or Hillsborough County. The political corruption was helpful in his Bolita rackets. By 1910, Wall was the Bolita king and had pushed aside many of the gambling operations found in kingpins. The Cuban lottery was no longer Cuban-controlled, but instead was controlled by a bloodthirsty elite who didn't hesitate to kill anyone who encroached on his territory. There are at least 6 violent murders known to have been the result of trying to overthrow Wall's operations. Who knows how many more deaths came as an indirect result of the same crime. On the other side of the coin, Wall was described as soft-spoken and charitable. He gave money not only to churches and philanthropic groups. He was specifically known to have, according to his cousin, handed out $1,000 worth of half-dollar coins to kids at the children's home at Christmas. It's hard to say much about Charlie Wall's personal life. It's true that he had 2 wives, Helen Leah Rosenberg, whom he married in 1913 and would divorce sometime around the mid to late 1920s, and Audrey Porter, to whom he would remain married until his death. It does not appear that Wall had any children. Perhaps his biggest and most notable act of philanthropy was in 1910 during the cigar workers' strike. It is reported that Wall would provide food and finances to over 900 working-class families, many of whom were of Cuban heritage. This gave him the nickname the White Shadow, which might sound like a really interesting noir film, but has more of the idea of a benevolent figure that cannot quite be accessed, like a shadow, who was also a white guy. I would venture to say that this move was more strategic than philanthropic. After all, by taking care of these 900 families, he secured the trust of the working class and several underlings to do his dirty work for him. You can see what the up-and-coming Italian Mafia had to contend with in Tampa. In addition to the Tampa elites, Wall now held the heart of the Latin communities in the palm of his hand, whose poll workers would be happy to look the other way on his behalf. This included Cuban mobster Evaristo Tito Rubio, with whom he co-owned the El Dorado Club and Casino. Rubio could be described as Wall's underboss if Wall's organization had adhered to the traditional Sicilian Cosa Nostra mafia structure. Despite the seemingly impossible odds, the Italian mafia in Tampa was coming for Wall's power. This growing tension came to a head during the city's era of blood from 1930 to 1959, with the majority of the violence taking place from 1930 to 1940. During this time, there were over 25 mafia-related murders. When Prohibition began in 1920, Charlie Wall made the mistake of not getting involved. Think of this as a loss of an investment, like not investing in personal computers in the 1980s and instead keeping the money in your pocket. Wall took part in Prohibition in so much as that he continued serving alcohol at his gambling operations in brothels, but he stayed out of the trade. This gave the Italian mafia the means, resources, and opportunity to overthrow the Belita king in the 1930s. On June 9, 1930, while standing in front of his garage door, Wall received a shoulder wound from a gunman in a speeding car. This attempt on Wall's life would begin Tampa's era of blood. Wall did not take this lying down, though, and would see to it that at least 3 top players of the Italian mafia were gunned down in retaliation. Wall's power was beginning to slip. In 1931, when a federal court found Wall guilty of a narcotics violation, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but the conviction was overturned by the U.S. Court of Appeals. A nice recovery, but there were more issues coming his way. In response to the murders of their associates, the Tampa Mafia, under the control of Ignacio Antinori at the time, on November 10, 1936, orchestrated the shooting of one of Wall's top lieutenants, George Saturday Zarate, in front of the El Dorado Casino by 2 gunmen from a moving vehicle. Zarate would survive and head to Cuba, where he would later establish Trafficante's gambling operations. So much for loyalty. On March 9, 1939, Tito Rubio was shot and killed by Wall's Tampa Mafia rivals. Additionally, it was during the subsequent grand jury hearing that Wall would be officially recognized as the financier and boss of the Belita rackets. With the growth of the Italians' power by way of bootlegging, they began trying to push Wall out of the gambling business. A second attempt was made on Wall's life on June 4, 1939. While he was driving, Wall survived this attempt on his life from gunmen in an armored truck during a high-speed chase. After Wall got away, the assailants attempted to burn the truck to hide the evidence. According to Wall's later testimony, "I ducked down, and he tore my car up pretty bad. So I took my foot off the accelerator, and the car was moving, and I don't know. I guess I kind of outguessed him, and turned the wheel to the right, and the car went up the sidewalk and wobbled a bit. I heard the truck leave, and I was very glad to part company with them and drive on home." In the spring of 1940, while Wall was driving, yet another attempt would be made on the Belita king's life. When he saw the assailants coming, he slammed the car into reverse, kept his head down, and survived. There actually seems to have been at least 5 attempts on Wall's life, one of which involved a bodyguard driver when Wall was attacked. Some reports seem to conflate this story with the story of the alleged 3rd attempt on his life, and an attempt in which Wall was reading the newspaper on the porch of his Ybor home, or maybe it was at a restaurant. This particular account was brought to life by artist Ferdy Pacheco in his work Charlie Wall Shot at Columbia Restaurant. In later testimony, Charlie Wall would explain that he only recalled 3 attempts on his life when questioned by Senator Lester Hunt in the 1950 Kefauver hearings. Senator Hunt asked, "Just to clear things up, Mr. Wall, were there 5 or 3 attempts?" Wall replied, "I don't think I remember the other 2. Hunt said, "You probably would have remembered." Wall agreed. "Oh, yes, sir." Hunt asked, "Was there any reason anyone would want to make target practice out of you?" Wall answered, "No, sir." By 1940, the Tampa family, now under the control of Santo Trafficante Sr. after Antinori's death, seemingly not on Wall's orders, which I'm sure he was probably pretty sore about, was able to push Charlie Wall out of the city. The story goes that in exchange for his departure, Trafficante Sr. promised Wall's protection. Wall knew there was no other choice for him. He was beaten. He took Trafficante's offer and retired to Miami, Florida. Charlie Wall left a well-oiled machine for Santo Sr.'s takeover. And if you would like to learn more about what he did with that well-oiled machine, make sure to check out the video from a couple weeks ago spotlighting Santo Trafficante Sr. Today we're talking about Charlie Wall, and he was in Miami during this time. While in Miami, he would attempt to make inroads into that city's gambling operations, but would be arrested in June of 1950 in connection to a South Florida gambling ring with New York investors, specifically in connection with Frank Costello. It is reported that during this time in Miami throughout the 1940s, while the Trafficante family was putting their stamp on what had once been his city. That Wall, perhaps in the throes of bitterness, perhaps to get out of the South Florida gambling charge, or perhaps a combination of both, turned state's witness. He turned over his books to law enforcement regarding the illegal gambling operations in southern Florida and returned to Tampa. He would go on to spill his guts about Tampa, and it is said that Wall missed the limelight. A fatal mistake. But Wall did manage to squeeze out one last 15 minutes of fame before meeting his maker. In December of 1950, when the Kefauver Senate committee hearings came to Tampa, we see Charlie Wall expose and denounce all he could about the Sicilian Mafia. Although he had been out of the game for several years, he still had plenty of evidence, history, and information to cause a headache for the ruling Trafficante family. Santo Sr. and his son, Santo Jr., had both left town to avoid testifying in the hearing. Wall got what he wanted. He was back in the spotlight, but not for long. It was clear that Wall was making himself a target. According to Hillsborough County Deputy Ellis Clifton, he tried to warn Wall. "I said, 'Mr. Wall, you know they're going to kill you.' Wall answered Clifton saying, 'Yeah, I don't give a damn.' Wall had still been under the protection of Santo Trafficante Sr., so no attempts would be made on his life. However, Santo Sr. would die in 1954. It makes one wonder about Wall's emotional state. He had and lost everything. Life might have seemed hopeless. Unlike his grandfather, a firm Baptist, and his father after him, an Episcopalian, Wall didn't seem to have any religious leanings that would give him any sense of hope or security after his death. He had fallen into his father's habit of drunkenness and seemed listless in his day-to-day behaviors. I wonder if he had a death wish, one last go-around with organized crime before the thing that made him was the thing that inevitably put an end to him. It's poetic and macabre if true, but this would actually fall right in line with Charlie Wall's personality at this point in his life. After a night of heavy drinking in April of 1955, Wall was offered a ride home by Italian gambler Nick Scaglione, a man who Wall knew well, but a man who was a made member of the Trafficante Mafia family. Scaglione maintained that he dropped Wall off early in the evening, and would then have proof of his whereabouts from then on. The next time Charlie Wall was seen was dead in his bedroom, next to a copy of his testimony in the Kefauver hearings. Charles McKay Wall was murdered in his home on April 18, 1955. He was beaten with a blackjack. He was stabbed 10 times. His head was battered with a baseball bat, and his throat was slit. Although his murder remains unsolved to this day, most suspect, including Deputy Clifton, that this hit was ordered by Santo Trafficante Jr. Charles M. Wall was buried at Oak Lawn Cemetery in Tampa, Florida. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Racket Reviews discussing Tampa's organized crime founder, Charlie Wall. Charlie Wall had a very strange origin story when it comes to organized crime, but would you expect anything less from the founder of Florida's organized criminal network? You Floridians are a different breed anyway, and it seems that organized crime is no exception to that rule. Make sure to let me know in the comment section below or on Facebook and Twitter what you think about Charlie Wall. Also, don't forget to utilize the comment section and social media to let me know who or what you would like to see covered next. I always love hearing from you, and I'm always happy to investigate. Make sure to like, subscribe, and click notifications to get more Mafia content sent directly to your sub box. Ciao!